So we have, yeah, this is the end of week 14, April 22nd. It's Wednesday. So I talked about students, you guys need to finish up your packet tracers. There's some packet tracers for the last module, module 17. Then there's this final packet tracer. That's due the Thursday after the last class, but you don't want to wait to the last minute. You can take it up to 40 times. You don't want to do that. There's no final unless an individual wants to take the final. And we're going to do a couple skills things next week like we did today. We did some skills things today. The students will need to be able to configure a router and a switch and the connection between them. The default gateway going out, I think we'll leave that in there, so you'll just have part of it to configure. You won't have the whole thing necessarily to configure. The next step, the June, it's most of June, beginning of July, is the next networking class. So you want to make sure you're set. The next class in May is the data assurance, but following the next networking class will be in June. And that will be a little demanding. We're talking about security right now. Data assurance is the next security class, and that's the May term. Be some groups, mornings 8 to 11:45. We'll split that up into different parts. And it's Monday through Thursday, so we get a little break on the weekends. Not that there's a whole lot you can do, but at least you get a break. I'll mention this right now. There are a couple switches that will not allow you to do SSH because of the legacy internetworking operating system. And I think it's 26 and I don't know, maybe 28. I'm not sure about that. So as soon as you try to do that work to set it, it won't let you because it can't. We talked a little bit about SSH, the steps. You might want to write that down, like the steps to configure devices. Have a place where you can do that. We talked about some security things. We talked about ports, MAC addresses, DHCP, snooping, and so forth. We talked about, you disable ports, that helps a lot in your switches, but somebody connects to a port with a laptop with DHCP. If this device, they get their DHCP here, this becomes a default gateway before it sends things out. Then that becomes a man in the middle. We talked about VPNs, and be careful about the VPN services. I wouldn't use any of the free ones. Nowadays, with most all websites are some form of secure, it's probably not as big of an issue as it used to be, but there are companies out there like Nord that do that, and they use servers all over the world in order to do their VPN. I'm guessing, I don't know if I read this or saw it, maybe they use AWS to do that. Okay. And yeah, then I mentioned they end up moving all of their servers out of Russia because Russia was requiring these VPNs to allow them to see the traffic before it was encrypted. Okay. We talked about the issue where you have your Linux box and it automatically can log into a server. Well, if this Linux box becomes compromised, now that server is compromised. So you have to be aware of how you do that. All right, so we talked about accessing our AWS. I demonstrated today accessing Linux machine in the cloud, and I did it from Work Server 2. or from home, I would do it from a Linux machine. And you can also set up PuTTY to do that also. We'll talk a little more about that next week. We're going to talk a little more about AWS and so forth. We did a lab. The students worked on an SSH lab plus a few other things, some skills things. And I told them they could go ahead and use this if they wanted to for the IP domain in setting up their SSH. Oh yeah, we talked about VPNs here. You go to their site and then they send you in the internet. So you have to trust them that they're not selling your data and so forth. This slide doesn't have a whole lot of information on it. I reviewed packet tracer skills. We talked about security. Two things: either they're gathering information, or they access and do bad things once they get in, or they deny services. So most of the things that happen, threats, are, they kind of fall into these three general categories. And then we talked about viruses and a lot of the threats. We went through those already. We talked about threats and are you vulnerable, and then how much risk are you going to take? Are you going to mitigate everything, or remove the risk, or take somewhere in between? You never mitigate all of it, okay? We talked a little bit about firewall, DMZ, work server here. Some companies then would communicate back and forth this way. They might have, you have a web services, but your SQL might be internal. So you have to be careful that, like, this web server doesn't get compromised, in which then somehow they get back into the main network. Yeah, we have a firewall. So outside traffic, let me re-emphasize this. So we have a firewall, okay? So zero traffic can get in. Now if traffic here, legitimate traffic, goes out, then it lets that traffic back in, okay? But if we want people to get to this work server for web services or, coursework, what we do is we opened up these ports to allow people to come in and access that server. And that's it.